Hi, I'm coming at you today from the headquarters of the Dean of the School of Urban Ministries, and in case you didn't know, that is me. Now that you're impressed with my credentials, we're now, on a serious note, ready to start one of the most important parts of the inductive Bible study process, and that's really what we've been waiting for probably since you first walked into or took online Matthew or Mark IBS 1. We've been dying to not just say what the text seems to be talking about in the past, but actually talk about the payoff of all of our hard work in the text, which is what is God's word for me in my life today? What is God's word for my community of faith? And one of the things I want us to keep on the front burner this whole semester, and I hope for the rest of your ministry, is what is God's will for those who are on the peripheries of our communities of faith, those who do not yet believe in Jesus Christ. And that's the process of evaluation and application. I've included several different sets of instructions. I have a longer discussion of what evaluation application is, and I also have a kind of a shorter outlined abbreviated method sheet that you can follow. The instructions for it are also going to be in each of the modules, but I want to go over it. Again, this is the whole point of biblical interpretation. I know sometimes it's tiring doing survey and then interpretation, but now we got to add the last part, the payoff point part, the so what part. If you'd ask me what I think the purpose of biblical interpretation or what the goal of biblical interpretation is, a few years ago I just came to the conclusion that it's conversion. The text wants to convert us to its perspective. So when we're thinking about evaluation and application, we're actually talking about listening attentively for what the text or what God through the text is demanding of the lives of all human beings. It's learning how to speak human. It's given that word. It's calling Christians to come closer to the cross. It's calling those in the world to come to the cross for the first time. It's about us realigning with God's will. It's with us calling those on the outside to align with God's will. So how do you do this? Well, in a nutshell, we start with our interpretive summaries from our interpretation section. This is why it's so important for us to be clear, concise, and as specific as possible in how you write those interpretive summaries. Don't just do broad theological categories. Doesn't do us any good saying this text teaches us that God is love. For the one thing, most of us probably knew that before we started. So if you think the text is talking about God's love, talk about specifically how the text is talking about and describing God's love. If this were the only text you had in the Bible, what would you know about God's love based on it? Does that make sense? So we start with that. So start with a truth or a couple of truths or some part of your interpretive summary from your interpretation, and begin. That's where you start with evaluation. And then what you're going to do is you go back to the text again. And you want to ask yourself, can I figure out what the original application or appropriation would have been of this truth? You want to look at the text itself. Were there any limits on who this would apply to? Did it only apply to dogs, not cats? Did it apply to everyone? Does it apply to Christians, non-Christians? Did it apply just to the synagogue? Or who was the original application for? That gives us some baselines for understanding. Was there anything in the text that seems to be totally culturally bound? We want to try to make a initial judgment on that. Then the next step is we give it a canonical reading. How does say a particular psalm, what does a psalm say, and how does that fit into the rest of what the Old Testament says, and then also the New Testament? Now, you don't want to look for endless numbers of texts. Basically, you want to find 2 or 3 texts in each testament that interfaces with the teaching of, say, the psalm that we're working on for this week. And then you want to describe specifically how those other texts interact with the psalm. Do they reaffirm it? Do they challenge it? Do they nuance it? And then see how both the Old and New Testament does that. And then on the basis of that, you want to rewrite your starting point, the truth that came out of your interpretation. We want to now write an evaluative synthesis. In light of how you've read the text canonically, in light of how you've discerned what its original application is, how would you rewrite that original truth in light of the canonical dialogue you've just taken, as you've just done? And then the last thing is you take that, your evaluative synthesis, and you look for ways then to interface that truth with your context now. Now, when you're thinking about evaluation application, I want you, especially those of you who are working in churches, think about it. How would you apply this truth, not just in your own personal life, but in the life of your community of faith? And then not just in your community of faith, but in light of the whole community around your community of faith. I've included in the instructions some reflections on mission, holiness, and community, and how you would hear that, an insider would hear that, and how an outsider would hear that. I hope this little overview just kind of gets you started. Again, look at the written instructions, and as always, you can post any questions that you have about evaluation application online. And this is a work in progress. You're invited to fail epically again, but do your best. We'll give you feedback, and we'll get this thing, we'll get you working at your maximum level here as soon as we can. Again, God bless you. We've had a great semester so far. Let's keep it up.